My name is David Foster, and I've always considered myself a man of quiet calculation. You could say I was the type to observe before acting, the one who could walk into a room and read the mood of everyone in it without ever saying a word. There's power in silence, a power I'd always known how to wield. I wasn't arrogant, far from it, but I knew who I was and what I could do. For years, I worked as a senior analyst at an emerging tech firm, one that had seen impressive growth thanks to my input. I wasn't a CEO, but I might as well have been. The company had flourished under my strategic direction. I fine-tuned the processes, streamlined operations, and engineered the kind of future most companies only dream of. And when the time came for a major product launch, I poured every ounce of my effort into making sure it was successful. Everyone knew it. I had become indispensable. I guess that's why it hurt so much when it happened. I was in my office that day, an ordinary Thursday, when I got the call. It was Ethan Black, the CEO of the company. Ethan, the man who had always spoken highly of me, the man I had trusted with my career, was on the other end of the line. The same man who, just weeks before, had told me that my future at the company was guaranteed. David, his voice was tight, but it wasn't the tightness of regret. It was the tightness of a man who had made up his mind long ago and was only now getting around to delivering the bad news. We're going in a different direction. There it was, the betrayal in 3 simple words. A different direction. As if the countless hours I had spent pouring my expertise into the company, sacrificing weekends and nights to ensure our success, had amounted to nothing. As if I was just another cog in the machine, easy to replace. Ethan, what's going on? We've just hit record numbers. The launch went off without a hitch. You're telling me this after everything. I could feel my heart rate quicken, but I kept my voice steady. The last thing I wanted was for him to know how deeply his words had struck. There was a pause on the other end, and then he spoke again, as if he was trying to soften the blow. It's not about your work, David. You've done great things here, but there's no easy way to say this. The board's decided it's time for a change. You've been let go. The word stung, but what hurt even more was the complete lack of emotion in his tone. It was as if he had no more respect for me than he would a contractor who hadn't met a deadline. As if I hadn't been the one to keep the entire ship afloat. I could feel the anger building inside me, but I forced it down. This wasn't about emotion anymore. This was about understanding, about calculating what to do next. I spent the next few hours in a fog, my mind racing between confusion and disbelief. How could Ethan do this to me? After everything I had done, after all the late nights and early mornings, after sacrificing personal time and peace for the sake of the company's success. How could he just let me go without so much as a thank you? But then, as I sat in my car, staring blankly at the office building, a sickening realization washed over me. This wasn't just a business decision. This was personal. Ethan had been my mentor once. He'd been the one who'd taken me under his wing, shown me the ropes of the corporate world, promised me that together we would lead the company to new heights. I had trusted him. And yet, in the span of a few sentences, he had destroyed everything we had built, not just professionally but personally as well. But it wasn't the firing that broke me. It was the way it happened. The call came without warning. No thanks. No explanation. Just a cold, detached line about changing direction. Ethan had chosen his future at the expense of mine. It was the ultimate betrayal. And I knew, deep in my bones, that I couldn't just let it go. The emotional weight of it hit me hardest in the days that followed. I could barely leave my apartment. I stayed in the dark, pacing around like a caged animal, my mind reeling. How had it come to this? How had the man I had once considered a mentor, someone I had respected, decided I was expendable? I thought about the years of loyalty, the countless hours I'd put into the company. I thought about the private moments of camaraderie we had shared, the trust one had placed in him. And I thought about the woman who had been involved in all of this, the woman I had been dating at the time. Her name was Claire. She had been with me through the highs and lows, always supportive, always encouraging. We'd been talking about a future together. We'd even made plans for our first vacation together in years, a small retreat to get away from the pressure. That was before everything changed. That was before Ethan's betrayal tore my life apart. And now, as I sat in my apartment, struggling to come to terms with everything that had happened, I received the second blow. A message from Claire. "I'm sorry, David. I need space. I think you and I are just not right for each other anymore." Just like that. In a message, she ended things. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal too. I stood frozen for a moment, the room spinning around me. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, my breath becoming shallow. This wasn't just about being fired. This was about the complete collapse of everything I had worked for, everything I had trusted. My world had crumbled, and all I could do was stand there, helpless and enraged. And in that moment, as I stood amidst the wreckage of my life, I realized something. This wasn't the end for me. No, this was just the beginning. I wasn't going to let this go. Ethan, Claire, no one was going to get away with this. I would make them both pay. It wasn't the anger that kept me awake that night, though it gnawed at me relentlessly, like a constant, biting itch beneath my skin. No, it was something far deeper. The betrayal had ignited a fire within me, not one of chaotic rage, but of cold, calculated resolve. Revenge wasn't a simple act, it was an art. It required precision, time, and an understanding of the human psyche that I had spent years developing. And I was going to use that understanding to take back what had been stolen from me. I started by retracing every moment, every interaction I'd had with Ethan and Claire. It was a quiet, almost meditative process. I sat at my desk, surrounded by stacks of documents and old files, everything that tied me to my past life, both professional and personal. The first step was to clear my mind of everything except the plan. I needed to understand the nature of their betrayal. How had it happened? Why had they both discarded me so easily? Ethan had always been the image of control, always so self-assured. He ran the company with a ruthless efficiency that I'd admired at first. But in that efficiency, he had underestimated me. I had always been in the shadows, the behind-the-scenes architect of the company's success, and he had taken that for granted. But now I had a different role. I was no longer his subordinate. I was the one in charge of my own fate. I had a head start and I intended to use it. My first step was to gather information, and I was good at that. I knew Ethan's routines, his likes, his weaknesses. I knew the people around him, the ones who were loyal to him and the ones who weren't. I had spent years observing, listening, understanding how he operated. It was like solving a puzzle, one piece at a time. Claire had always been more of an open book, but even in her transparency, there were subtle cracks. She was the kind of person who wore her emotions on her sleeve, who would often let her guard down in moments of vulnerability. And that was exactly what I needed to exploit. She had been my partner in the darkest moments, and I knew her better than she thought. I knew what she was afraid of, what she loved, what she could be manipulated into doing. My initial phase of preparation was methodical. I reached out to a few trusted old colleagues, people who hadn't been in the loop of my dismissal, but who had known me well enough to offer valuable insight into Ethan's recent moves. One of them, Mark, had always been an ally. He'd been on the receiving end of many of Ethan's decisions and knew more than he let on. A few quiet conversations and subtle inquiries gave me the ammunition I needed. But it wasn't just about the people, I needed resources too. Information was one thing, but it was time to start putting things into motion. I knew the company's finances, I knew the patterns of the board, and I knew Ethan's connections. My plan wasn't going to be an explosion of force. It was going to be slow, deliberate, and calculated. I wanted Ethan to feel the pressure building around him until it became too much to handle. The first part of my plan involved hitting Ethan where he least expected it, his financial empire. His wealth was tied to his company, but there were other strings, threads that connected him to a network of investments, side ventures, and other business dealings. I'd spent enough time studying his lifestyle to know the key players involved. The first of these was his business partner, Victor, a man who had never fully trusted Ethan but was always too afraid to confront him directly. He was going to be my first tool. I reached out to Victor under the guise of offering my expertise in restructuring his personal portfolio. It was an easy excuse, one that he would buy without question. After all, he knew I had been the mastermind behind the company's financial success. What he didn't know was that I wasn't interested in his money. What I wanted was to sow the seeds of doubt. I had already done the groundwork, studied the patterns of Ethan's investments, and I knew where Victor's interests lay. I began subtly planting ideas in Victor's mind, questions about Ethan's loyalty, small rumors of financial discrepancies, just enough to make Victor question his partner's integrity. It was a game of whispers, a game that required patience. At the same time, I turned my attention to Claire. I didn't need her to know what I was planning. She was still too emotional from our breakup, but she had something I needed: access to Ethan's personal files. Ethan was meticulous, but Claire had always been the one to organize his personal life. She knew where he kept his passwords, his secret accounts, his communications with those who mattered most to him. I used my knowledge of her vulnerabilities to draw her back into my orbit, pulling on the threads of nostalgia and old emotions. I started small, sending her a message every few days, reminding her of the times we had shared, the way we had supported each other through thick and thin. She responded cautiously at first, but as time went on, she softened. Her feelings of guilt over our breakup played into my hands. I knew she would never fully believe I could forgive her, but that was exactly what I needed her to believe. Her trust in me was something I could exploit without her even realizing it. Slowly, I maneuvered. I made my moves with the subtlety of a chess master, thinking several steps ahead. It wasn't just about getting back at Ethan or Claire. It was about reclaiming my self-respect. And that's where the true challenge lay. I didn't want to feel like the victim anymore. I didn't want to feel like the man who had been wronged. No, I wanted to be the man who had taken control, the man who had engineered his own victory. This wasn't just revenge. This was a transformation. The pieces were falling into place, and with each day that passed, I could feel the tension building. Ethan was getting nervous. Claire was slipping back into my grasp, and Victor's doubts were beginning to grow. I could see the storm approaching, but I wasn't afraid. I was ready, but revenge was a dangerous game. The real test would come when I had to make the final move. The first crack in Ethan's carefully constructed facade appeared 3 weeks later. It wasn't a grand gesture, no dramatic confrontation or public humiliation, but a small shift, a barely perceptible one. He began to show signs of paranoia, the kind that creeps in when you've spent too many years manipulating others and forget what it's like to be in control. I could see it in the way he began to avoid certain meetings, in the strained conversations he had with his closest colleagues. He was starting to unravel, and I hadn't even had to lay a finger on him yet. I'd already set the wheels in motion. The whispers I had planted in Victor's ear were beginning to have the desired effect. The smallest seed of doubt, carefully nurtured, had begun to blossom. Victor, ever the skeptic, had begun to question Ethan's integrity, particularly after I subtly steered him toward some discrepancies in Ethan's financial dealings. It wasn't anything that would immediately land Ethan in legal trouble, but it was enough to make him second-guess his position. Enough to make him question whether he was being left in the dark about certain key decisions. Victor had already started digging deeper, casually asking questions, gently prodding Ethan's trusted financial advisors. Ethan's cool, calculated demeanor was no match for the subtlety of these probing questions. The cracks were there, hidden beneath layers of confidence, but now they were starting to show. On the other side of the chessboard, Claire was the wild card. She had agreed to meet me once, under the pretense of wanting closure. I knew she hadn't forgiven me, but she wanted to understand why I hadn't fought for our relationship, why I had walked away so easily. That meeting, in hindsight, had been the first piece of my revenge that I'd actually enjoyed. The warmth of her gaze, the soft longing in her voice as she asked for forgiveness. I could see how much she regretted her decision, but that regret would soon be her undoing. I had come prepared. The emotions she had once thought she could rely on, the ones she had once believed would keep me tied to her, were now the very tools I would use against her. She still had access to Ethan's private files, and I knew she wouldn't be able to resist offering me just a glimpse of the things I needed. I didn't ask directly, no, that would have been too obvious. But I let the conversation flow naturally, letting the hints fall like breadcrumbs, and she, with her insecurities, was all too eager to pick them up. 2 weeks after that meeting, she sent me the first piece of the puzzle, a key to Ethan's personal account. She'd sent it in a simple text message, barely more than a whisper, almost like an afterthought. Just in case you need it. That was all I needed. The first taste of revenge was as sweet as it was calculated. I accessed the account, combing through every document, every transaction. What I found wasn't earth-shattering, but it was enough. Enough to solidify my belief that Ethan's power had been built on lies, on deception, on promises broken to the people who had trusted him the most. I could feel the adrenaline surge through me as I uncovered the threads that would eventually be his undoing. But it wasn't just about destroying Ethan's empire, it was about taking back what he had taken from me, my sense of control. It was then that I realized the real beauty of this revenge. I didn't need to humiliate him publicly, didn't need to tear him down with grand gestures or confrontations. The true power of my revenge lay in the slow burn, the subtle dismantling of everything he had worked for. The more I learned about his empire, the more I saw how vulnerable it really was. It wasn't a fortress. It was a house of cards, and all I had to do was blow on it just the right way. I could have sent him crashing down with a single email, a single call to the right people, but I didn't. I wasn't interested in that kind of quick satisfaction. No, I wanted something deeper. I wanted Ethan to feel the fear creeping in, day by day, until it consumed him. I wanted him to doubt every step he took, to question the loyalty of those around him, to look over his shoulder every time the phone rang. But I couldn't do it alone. That was where Victor came in. The seeds of doubt I had planted in him had started to sprout, and he was beginning to question his partnership with Ethan more openly. I had fed him just enough information to make him curious, and now he was doing the hard work for me. He had started asking questions of Ethan's closest colleagues, subtly probing into the discrepancies I had planted in his mind. He was becoming suspicious of Ethan's management, slowly but surely. It was only a matter of time before he began to confront Ethan directly. As for Claire, she was a different story. She didn't know it yet, but she was the final piece of the puzzle. I had already begun to turn the screws, inch by inch, creating situations where she would unknowingly sabotage Ethan's personal life, all while believing she was helping me. The deeper I went into this, the more I realized that this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about something else, something that had been buried deep inside me for years. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my self-worth, my sense of control over the life I had lost. Ethan had thought I was weak, that I was disposable. But now I was the one in control. Every move I made was carefully calculated, designed to make him question his decisions, to make him second-guess every action he took. Revenge wasn't a fire, it was a slow burn, and I was the one stoking the flames. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in patience. It was an emotional roller coaster that I didn't anticipate, though I had prepared for the feeling of cold satisfaction as Ethan's world started to crack. It wasn't the sharp, jolting joy I'd imagined. Instead, it was more of a heavy silence that settled deep within me. For all the planning, for all the meticulous care I had taken in executing my revenge, there was a part of me that had always believed that once Ethan felt the consequences, the weight of his betrayal, I would feel some kind of relief. I would finally feel whole again. But that wasn't how it worked. Ethan had always been a man of control, a man who wore his confidence like armor. To watch that armor slowly chip away, piece by piece, was strangely unsatisfying. The first crack had come when Victor, the man I had planted the seeds of doubt in, had confronted Ethan about the financial discrepancies. It had been subtle at first, a casual remark at a business dinner, a half-joking question about a seemingly off-kilter investment. Ethan's reaction had been immediate, sharp, and defensive. He tried to laugh it off, but I could see the tension in his face. The cracks were widening. I watched from the shadows as he began to retreat further into himself, his confidence turning into something more akin to desperation. Meetings were missed, phone calls ignored, and those who once trusted him began to see his uncharacteristic behavior as a sign of weakness. I had never seen Ethan like this, and the power that came from watching him squirm was supposed to bring me peace, but it didn't. It wasn't until Claire, unknowingly, became a pawn in the next phase of my revenge that the true weight of my actions hit me. I had carefully orchestrated her return to Ethan's life, inviting her back under the guise of making amends, of offering her some sense of closure. What I hadn't predicted was how much she would still carry her own guilt. She had started reasserting herself into Ethan's personal space, all the while believing that her help was what would mend the rift between the two of them. She sent Ethan a few friendly reminders about the inconsistencies I had planted in his personal life, urging him to keep an eye on certain things. Little did she know, those same reminders were slowly pushing Ethan to confront the very mistakes he'd made, the ones I had engineered. One night, I received an unexpected call from Claire. Her voice trembled on the line, something unfamiliar in its tone. "David, I think I've made a mistake. Ethan's been different, you know? He's been pulling away, shutting down, and it's making me question everything. I don't know if I can keep doing this." Her words, laced with vulnerability and a deep sense of guilt, should have satisfied me. It was a small victory, proof that the path I had set in motion was working. But there was something else, something deeper that lingered in my chest. Regret. I could see it now. Claire was unraveling just like Ethan. Both of them, in their own way, were paying for their actions. And yet, I wasn't sure that the satisfaction I'd expected would fill the void I felt inside. I had set out to make them pay, and now that they were, it felt less like a win and more like a hollow victory. The sting of betrayal that had once burned with fury had dulled, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. I pushed that feeling aside. Revenge wasn't supposed to be about feeling good. It wasn't supposed to feel like closure. I had taken control. That was enough. That should have been enough. But the aftermath wasn't over yet. Ethan's world continued to unravel. I hadn't made him aware of the full scope of what I had done. Not yet. I didn't need to. His every misstep, every moment of weakness, had been enough to undo the sense of invincibility he once exuded. By the time Victor had been pushed to confront him again, this time with the full knowledge of the discrepancies, it was too much for Ethan to handle. The press began to catch wind of his mismanagement, and rumors about his leadership failure spread like wildfire within the company. I watched it all unfold, through anonymous messages, through the media, and through the few remaining colleagues who had stuck by him. Ethan's grip on the company had slipped, and with it, his life. Yet still, the sense of victory remained elusive. I went back to the place where it all started, the office. I wasn't there to revel in Ethan's downfall, but rather to witness the aftermath in person. The corridors were quieter now, the familiar hum of the office no longer filled with the optimism it once had. The air was thick with tension, and the power dynamics had shifted. Ethan, the man who once stood tall, was now nowhere to be seen. The company had suspended him pending an investigation into his actions, and whispers of his downfall echoed through the office like a funeral march. And there, in the middle of it all, I was, silent, watching, not as a victim anymore but as the architect of this destruction. But even as Ethan faced the immediate consequences of his betrayal, I couldn't help but notice the toll it had taken on me. I hadn't expected this level of detachment, this strange numbness. The revenge, the sweet taste of justice, was supposed to restore the balance that had been shattered by his callousness. But instead, it left me hollow. I realized then that I had become the very thing I had once despised. Someone who defined themselves by their ability to make others pay. Revenge had consumed me. I had dismantled everything that mattered to Ethan, but in the process, I had broken something inside myself as well. As I walked away from the office that evening, the weight of what I had done settled heavily on my shoulders. The satisfaction I had once anticipated was gone, replaced by an emptiness I hadn't prepared for. What had it all been for? Had I truly won? Or had I only become a mirror image of the man I had set out to destroy? For the first time since the plan had begun, I wasn't sure. The consequences of my revenge were more complex than I had anticipated, and I had no idea where this path would lead me. It's strange, isn't it? How when you finally get what you want, you realize it isn't what you thought it would be. Revenge, in all its meticulous execution, promised something I couldn't quite grasp in the chaos of my calculated actions. I'd spent months moving like a shadow, pulling strings behind the scenes, turning people against each other, watching them destroy themselves. The pleasure I thought I would feel, this overwhelming sense of vindication, never came. Instead, what replaced it was a gnawing sense of loss, of something irreplaceable slipping through my fingers. Months had passed since the company's board formally removed Ethan from his position. The investigations into his mismanagement continued, and the press had a field day with his fall from grace. His name became synonymous with failure, his decisions scrutinized under a microscope. Victor, the one I had manipulated so carefully, had taken over Ethan's responsibilities temporarily, and whispers of new leadership circled the company. The wreckage of Ethan's career lay scattered, and in my mind, it should have been enough. But when I think back now, I wonder, what was it all for? It wasn't just Ethan who had paid for the betrayal, it was me too. The initial rush, the thrill of seeing someone who had wronged me crumble under the weight of his own choices, should have felt like a triumph. Yet, every day that passed, the satisfaction I had once expected to feel slipped further and further away. The emptiness grew. I had expected that, in reclaiming what was taken from me, I would feel like I had returned to myself. But instead, I found I was a stranger in my own life. It wasn't just the absence of victory that unsettled me. It was the isolation that came with it. The people who had been close to me had started to drift away, unknowingly pushed away by the subtle changes in me. I had become cold, distant. Even Claire, whose involvement in this had been so critical, had eventually cut off all contact. She had become a casualty in this war I'd waged, and she didn't even know the full story. She'd left with the remnants of a fractured relationship and the scars of guilt that I had quietly inflicted on her. She, too, was an echo of what I had destroyed. The worst part was that I had never truly felt remorse. Not for Ethan, not for Claire. They had betrayed me, after all, and in my mind, I had earned the right to make them suffer. But as time went on, it wasn't their suffering that stayed with me. It was the hollow feeling, the way I felt nothing but the weight of my actions pressing down on me, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. I had become what I once despised, the man who had allowed vengeance to consume him, and in doing so, I had lost everything that once mattered. As I walked through the now quiet office, where I had once worked with Ethan side by side, I felt nothing. The walls seemed colder now, more lifeless. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead was deafening in its emptiness. I walked past my old desk, and I thought about all the moments I had spent there, crafting the strategies that had brought the company to the heights it had once reached. It all seemed like a lifetime ago, and yet there was nothing to show for it now. Ethan was gone. Claire was gone. The company, now under new leadership, had moved on. And here I was, a ghost in a shell of a life I had once built. The problem with revenge is that it doesn't offer closure. It doesn't fix what was broken. All it does is scatter the pieces further and further apart until you can't even remember what the original picture looked like. I thought about what I had gained. There had been a brief moment of satisfaction when Ethan had been removed, when his empire had crumbled, but that moment passed quickly, like a fleeting storm. And now, years later, I was left with the lingering question. Was it worth it? I had watched Ethan lose everything, the company he built, the respect he had once commanded. He was a shadow of the man he had been, wandering through life like a ghost, his every step haunted by the decisions he made. But in his destruction, there was no joy for me. There was no sweet revenge. There was only the cold realization that, in tearing him down, I had destroyed a part of myself in the process. In the end, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like a man who had won. I felt like a man who had traded one set of chains for another. I spent a long time in that office, staring at the empty desk. And then I left. I left not just the office, but the man I had become. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to leave. The last year had taught me a valuable lesson. The cost of revenge is never clear until it's too late. And once you've crossed that line, there's no going back. The question I asked myself then, as I walked away from it all, was not, was it worth it? But what do I do now? I didn't have the answer, and I don't think I ever will. But one thing is certain. Revenge may take everything from your enemy, but it can take everything from you too. Thank you for watching.